Thank you for joining us for another segment of Beyond COVID-19 with the Caregivers Society. I'm your host, Kieran Warren, and today we have Reverend Dr. Carroll D. Jenkins joining with us. Dr. Jenkins has been a Presbyterian minister for approximately 54 years, and he has worked in various roles within the corporate levels as well as the church levels. And it's very important that we talk to him because he's like a historical treasure within the denomination, and he's a trailblazer as well. So today, given with the climate that we're in right now, with the health crisis and other issues that are stemming from that, I wanted to discuss the role of the Black Church and African Americans and the National Presbyterian Caucus within the Presbyterian Church. And before we do so, before we begin with the history of the early founding of the Presbyterian Church or the Presbyterian denomination in America, along with Black Presbyterians, I want to introduce Reverend Jenkins. Reverend Jenkins, can you introduce yourself, where you're from, how long you've been a clergy in the Presbyterian denomination?
Well, I am Carroll Jenkins, Presbyterian minister, ordained in the Presbytery of Philadelphia in 1966, and have been active in the Presbyterian Church as a pastor, as an administrator and executive. I've been the executive of the largest synod in the denomination, as well as treasurer, stated clerk. I've been active in programming, in community activity, community organizing, and life of the Presbyterian Church.
Okay, thank you. So let's just begin with the history of Presbyterians in America. Where did the Presbyterian Church begin here in the USA?
The Presbyterian Church in America began along the eastern shore of Maryland and Delaware. Francis McKimmey came here from Ireland. He was a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian. The original Presbyterian churches were formed during the Reformation, which was the 16th century, which was a rebellion against Catholicism and the rule of the Catholic Church across much of Europe and many parts of the world. Francis McKimmey came here and started planting churches along the eastern shore of Delaware. And those churches began to grow, and he began to plant churches right on up the eastern shore in through Pennsylvania and all the way up to New York. The original presbytery ran from the eastern shore up to New York. And then, of course, internal struggles and all caused that to be broken up, so that we ended up with several presbyteries along the eastern shore. And the church has developed beyond that because it is an institutional church. It is not a congregational church. Congregations are formed inside the institution rather than congregations being formed and deciding that they're going to be Presbyterian. The structure has to create and form Presbyterian churches. And as soon as they're formed, they are related to a particular body inside the Presbyterian Church, which are presbyteries. And then when you get enough presbyteries together, they are combined into a synod. And ultimately, as we find today, the Presbyterian Church is organized even beyond regional synods to become a denomination that has had a major impact in much of the world. So that it's always a denomination that is related to institutional development and ties, and never individual congregations just operating by themselves.
I think that's very important that you stated the difference between an institutional church and a congregational church, because we know that there are a lot of institutional systems in America where African Americans have had to combat on our own So with speaking about that, I want to move into where was the birthplace of Black Presbyterians, and how have African Americans grown within the denomination since its birthplace here in America?
First Black church was African American church was founded in Philadelphia in 1807. Andrew Blackburn, who was a member of the Presbyterian of Philadelphia, decided, because of the growing free Black population in south part of Philadelphia, that there needed to be a thrust or reaching out into that community by the Christian church or the Presbyterian church. So he went to Tennessee and brought a former slave, John Gloucester, from Tennessee to Philadelphia. And John Gloucester, under the tutorage of Andrew Blackburn, began to move into the idea, the teachings, and the doctrine of the Presbyterian Church, and began then to move and to bring people together in South Philadelphia. The first African Presbyterian Church was originally founded with the support of the presbytery, Andrew Blackburn and some of the folks in the presbytery, with the sum of about $100 at 7th and Bainbridge in South Philadelphia. It grew from there to move to 17th and Fitzwater, and then from there it moved to 18th and Christian. And then when that building was condemned in 1956, they moved to West Philadelphia, 42nd and Girard, in 1957. And that's where the church still is lodged. But that's the first Black Presbyterian church in the denomination. John Gloucester had several sons, and they became Presbyterian ministers. One founded a church in New York. Another one they hoped would become the pastor of First African when John Gloucester died, but there was some internal feuding in the church, and so he did not become the pastor of the church. And they then formed the Central Presbyterian Church, which is combined to Lombard Central Church in West Philadelphia. And then the Black Presbyterians began to move beyond that. But once the first church was founded, there was a movement to begin to look at forming other churches. And with the freeing of slaves in 1865, there was a broad movement from the Northern Presbyterian churches. At that time, there was the Presbyterian Church USA and the Northern Presbyterian Church out of Pittsburgh, that since most of the Presbyterians at that point had grown on the Eastern Shore and their headquarters were either in Pittsburgh or in New York. When the slaves were freed, inside those structures, there were people who felt that it was important to reach out and to try to help educate and support the freed slaves. Mind you, these folks were inside the structure, but the structures themselves were not set up to essentially provide the support and direction for the growth of African American congregations. They did not hinder it, but it took individuals in the institutional churches or the congregations to begin to collect clothing and continue to and find ways to promote and support that community. In that movement, there were folks who felt that since the slaves were free, there needed to be some movement to try to find ways to educate these freed slaves. And so there was a massive movement out of New York and Pittsburgh to help to start schools in the South, so that as they started schools, they developed a broad network of almost 600 institutions that taught African Americans freed slaves, all the way from beginning school up to junior colleges and colleges. They also formed a network of support institutions to help to train those folks who were not going to school. In Sumter, South Carolina, there was an institution called Sheldon Institution that was related to the Second Presbyterian Church in Sumter, because the Black folks could not go to the First Presbyterian Church in Sumter. So Second Presbyterian Church became the place where the Northern Church was able to provide support for teaching women to sew and to do various kinds of things that would allow them to be employed. Men also were taught and were encouraged to develop trades and skills that would allow them to be hired out and to work. It was that movement of education primarily that became the tool for bringing African Americans or Black folks into the Presbyterian Church. So that the history of Black folks in the Presbyterian Church is essentially and critically tied to education as a way of evangelizing. Once you educated people, it was difficult for them to go back to the non-educated churches that they were a part of in the little towns and places of Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia and Florida and all around. So that the movement and development of that whole educational thrust helped to promote the growth of little Black churches all across the Southeast and into the Mid-South, as well as helping to develop colleges and develop a cadre of folks who became the Black professionals in many of the communities. So they promoted and developed a lot of your doctors, your teachers, your lawyers, and your who were in the African American community, supported through the educational thrust of the Presbyterian Church. As the church as an institution began to be more sensitive, they began to help to produce funds that helped to support those institutions. And many, of course, from those denominations served on the boards of those my phone
Okay.
rang and interrupted it. Let me cut it off.
Okay. So they served on the board.
They served on the board up until the 50s in helping to give direction. And many of the boards, like Johnson C. Smith University, the last white folks who were on there from the denominations began to transition off in the 1950s and early 1960s. So that there was always a tie, for example, to Pittsburgh Seminary, Pittsburgh Presbytery, which had a lot of strength from the Northern Presbyterian Church. And if you go visit that campus today, there are a lot of names for buildings on that campus that come from Presbyterians in that time and area who had money and who wanted to support the education of Black folks. They committed themselves to helping to build buildings and all that. There's a Carnegie Library, there's the Biddle Hall. Many of those, there's the Smith Hall. Johnson C. Smith is named after a colonel who comes out of the Pittsburgh area, and his wife donated a lot of money. And they ended up naming the school Johnson C. Smith. Before that, it was called Biddle. Now that's important because in the late 1860s, Biddle was the place where many Black men, particularly, began to get their college level education. There was a movement in the Black community then that once former slaves were free, the only way they could begin to move and matriculate in society in America was to have the educational base that everybody had, like white Presbyterians or white folks in the culture, so that Biddle was set up to provide that kind of education for men. So Biddle Institute became the place where men went. And that's, for me, that's important because my great-grandfather was a graduate of Biddle. My grandfather was a graduate of Biddle. He followed his father into there. My great-grandfather graduated from Biddle, and that's where he got his theological education also. And he became a pastor of a Presbyterian church in Charlotte, North Carolina. He eventually moved from Charlotte, North Carolina to South Carolina, where he became one of the first Black pastors of Well, in the area in Goodwill Presbyterian Church, which is outside of Sumter. That church was founded on a group of folks who walked out of the Black River Presbyterian Church and up the road. One of the plantation owners gave them an acre of land, and they built Goodwill Presbyterian Church, but Goodwill was also a school.
And that's good to know that the Presbyterian Church as a whole was in support of helping to educate African Americans during that time. So within the Presbyterian Church USA.
Yeah, the institution as such was lagging behind some individuals who clustered together to provide support for the freed blacks or the freed slaves in the South. So that's how you ended up with the development of a lot of these institutions that then began to evangelize folks into these Presbyterian congregations. And so as preachers were graduating from Biddle, they began to pastor these little congregations, and it graduated from there to begin to develop a theological institution at Biddle, which became Johnson C. Smith University Theological and Johnson C. Smith Theological Seminary. So that many of the Presbyterian pastors in the mid and late 20th century graduated from the university, went right across campus to the seminary, graduated from the seminary, and began to pastor these small Black churches in North Carolina, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, even to the point that there are some graduates of Johnson C. Smith Seminary in Charlotte who ended up out in Arizona, in Missouri and other places where there was a movement to develop Black congregations. At one point in the history, there were a large enough number of Black Presbyterian churches that when schisms and splits began to occur, some of these churches got together and split off and formed their own denomination, so that even today you have a second Cumberland Presbyterian Church, because as the main denomination split, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church split off from the main Presbyterian body, and inside the Cumberland Presbyterian Church there was a group of African Americans or Blacks who ended up splitting from the Cumberland Presbyterian Church to form the second Cumberland Presbyterian Church. So as a denomination, they still exist. They have their own moderators, their own stated clerk and structure and all the rest, just like the main bodies, except that it's Black Presbyterians. So, but as I said, the thrust of the Presbyterian movement was that through its educational program and reach, it helped to develop and evangelize Black folks into the Presbyterian Church. Schools like Johnson C. Smith University required the first 2 years of school, every student had to take religion. So that as a freshman, you took religion, as a sophomore, you took religion. And those religion courses caused the Presbyterian graduates to go, when they went back home, not to be comfortable in the little churches that they were a part of. So they became active in a movement. They were many times teachers and professionals. And so they became very active in developing congregations in their own area. So that even today, as we look at that history, the Presbyterian Church as such is visible in a lot of that support for the whole development of the community after slavery ended, and and when you look at historically, many of the folks who were very prominent in helping to develop and move the educational and community cause forward in the southeastern United States particularly, have a strong Presbyterian influence. And as you look at their movement, the Black Presbyterians began to move out of the South and into the North, and began to be very involved in helping to develop congregations, and very much involved in helping to develop community life in the North.
I think that's important to know, and thank you for sharing that history, because as a child of the Presbyterian Church USA, I've always known that education was an important piece to being a Presbyterian, particularly clergy and other members. Education and Black excellence was always suggested and taught from Sunday school throughout other areas within the Presbyterian Church, even with MBPC youth. The MBPC youth or MBPC really pushed for youth leadership. And that was something that those who were involved during that time could really take with them as they were continuing to grow, because now you're learning leadership skills. So with all of that, and you shared a little bit about your history with the Presbyterian Church, can we go into what made you want to become a Presbyterian minister? What I love about the colleagues of my mother coming up during the civil rights movement, I understand that the Black clergy at that time were very much into African roots, Blackness, social justice, and the betterment of their communities. So let's talk about what made you want to get involved with the denomination, and what was the importance of the Johnson C. Smith Seminary birthing Black Presbyterian ministers?
Well, the Presbyterian Church emphasizes educated ministers. You cannot become a minister in the Presbyterian Church unless you've gone 4 years of college and 3 years of theological training. That was a carryover from the European experience in that clergy had to be trained. Catholicism carried their priests through long extended training programs. So when the Reformed Church, the Presbyterian Church, was born, they did not want to neglect that educational process. And so they brought, when Francis McKinley came, he had been ordained in Ireland, and brought that Scotch-Irish influence and the Presbyterianism to America. First thing they did was to begin to work on developing an educational institution that would ordain and teach and develop pastors. So Princeton University was born to do that. But Princeton University would not allow Black folks to come in as students. Its history is caught up in institutional racism, like all institutions in America. But in order to be able to move forward from there, as the freed slaves began to have a need for education and Presbyterianism began to be important, that's what caused the development of Johnson C. Smith University and Biddle Institute prior to that, which did theological education for the for the Black pastors who became a part of that. And as I mentioned earlier, my great-grandfather was a graduate of Biddle. He went to theological training right there. And when he graduated from there, he was ordained as a Presbyterian minister and began to preach and teach in churches. One of the key functions of those churches was to begin to pull the community together, begin to organize the community, become a focal point for change out of the community to alleviate the conditions of poverty, social distress, education, and all that. So almost every church had some kind of educational program, It convened people for community change. It promoted and worked on general welfare of the community. Mary McLeod Bethune came out of a Presbyterian church in Maysville, South Carolina, when growing out of the ministry, extended ministry of Goodwill, and she came out of there with the whole sense of needing to be able to promote and develop an educational thrust that would improve the life in the community, so that the ministry of many of the Black churches was caught up in how to promote and enrich and encourage the development and improve the quality of life in the Black community. My great-grandfather, as I said, helped to start and worked in about 7 churches around Sumter, South Carolina. My grandfather was ordained an elder in the Presbyterian Church early in his life and served as an elder most of his life. As I went and began to grow and mature, the thrust was somehow to begin to try to follow in the family tradition. The family had always been involved in educational institutions. My grandmother's brother was a CME. In those days, it was the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. He had gone to the University of South Carolina, and they found out just before he graduated that he was Black and not white, because he could have passed for a little old Italian guy. And so he was kicked out and never did graduate from the University of South Carolina. But
decided not to pass.
He decided not, they found out who he was and would not allow him to graduate. But I have family members who came north and passed and worked as white, as well as became professionals as white, as well as folks who stayed in the South and functioned in that community, helping to educate. As I was on the way to becoming a dentist, which is what my grandfather was, as a pre-med student at Johnson C. Smith University, my grandmother stopped me one day when I was there in South Carolina, and we wanted to have a long talk with me. Her long talk ended up in her planting the seed in my spirit that I needed to stop thinking about becoming a dentist and become a minister like my great-grandfather. Of course, I wanted to ignore that because I was not going to be a preacher no matter what. But that seed grew. And even though I graduated from Smith with honors and then was looking forward to becoming a psychologist, that seed haunted me to the point that I ended up leaving seminary at Johnson C. Smith University, or Johnson C. Smith Theological Seminary, and came north to begin to go through a training program to go into psychology. And while I was looking at doing that, I started working for the state of Pennsylvania. And my time in the community only caused me to want to be more involved in community change, development, and promotion. I got pulled back into First African Presbyterian Church to to work with young people, teenagers. The senior highs were my specialty. Loved them. But that whole group ended up, because my time with them was such, the pastor ended up calling me one day, and we had lunch. He says, you ought to think about going back into the ministry.
Who was the pastor?
Pastor then was the Reverend Dr. Shelton Bishop Waters, who was a Pittsburgh graduate. He grew up in the Episcopal Church, went to Lincoln University, which is one of the places that used to train Presbyterian ministers. Black Presbyterian ministers were generally trained at Lincoln's Theological Seminary or Johnson C. Smith's Theological Seminary. Lincoln Seminary ended before Johnson C. Smith's Seminary, as the denomination began to start looking at making changes and transferring the teaching to other institutions, or combining institutions to do the teaching. Shelton Waters took me under his wing and sheltered me into Conwell School of Theology at Temple University. And I had already done time at Johnson C. Smith Theological Seminary. So when it was time for me to be ordained, the Presbyterian of Philadelphia allowed my time at Johnson C. Smith University to qualify me as a product of a Presbyterian theological institution, and then allowed me to be ordained then into the Presbyterian Church, because I had learned everything I needed to learn to be Presbyterian, the history and government and all of that, while I was at Conwell. My graduation and my ordination ordained me into not preaching ministry, but community ministry. I became a community organizer in West Philadelphia, which was right in the heart of the whole civil rights movement. And as I was moving out in 1966, the whole community and the whole civil rights movement was unfolding as we began. And so I ended up with senior highs, community ministry, civil rights development and thrust. And Philadelphia was alive then with different groups working on education, on housing, community development, all kinds of things, including education. And so I was caught up and swept up in all that and participated in all kinds of movements to try to promote racial change and racial involvement and acceptance in the institutions in Philadelphia. So it was that whole time that there was hardly a movement that came along through that whole period of time that in one way or another I wasn't either involved in, consulted with, and active part of, which then led me to be involved in other things outside of Philadelphia, which was what brought me to Chester, because some of the same things, dealing with the need in schools for the correct treatment and involvement and participation in the life of Black people in the educational system, in the schools, in the community, only served to help bring me to Chester with the invitation to help out and to help things to begin to happen. The whole thrust of Black Presbyterians historically has been the involvement in community change, growth, and promotion. My grandfather was the originator of helped to organize many societies and groups in South Carolina to try to bring Black folks together. Nowadays, you have the Masons. My grandfather was involved in helping to develop a group called the Knights of Pythagoras, who were involved in some of the same kinds of social ministries and health ministries that the Masons were. But there were no Black Masons back there then at the end of slavery. So he helped pull Black folks together for mutual benefit groups and societies around Goodwill, which is in Maysville, South Carolina.
What is your grandfather's name? You have a name?
My grandfather was Reverend I.D. Davis, Irby Duncan Davis.
And your father, who was also...
My grandfather was Dr. T.B. Davis, Thomas Benjamin Davis, who was an elder and Presbyterian through and through. My father was Carroll Douglas Reagan, who was a cabinet maker. And it's almost like it's in the genes, because the ability to do things with my hands has always been a part of who I am and who I was. So I can do woodwork, I can do plumbing, I can do electrical work, I can do cement work, I do roofing, I can do all kinds of repairs. And on top of that, my grandmother insisted that I learn how to cook.
Well, your family have been, they were very instrumental in your upbringing and your successes and career path becoming a Presbyterian minister. You spoke about being ordained in the Philadelphia Presbytery, which I think is important to note as well, because that Philadelphia is the home of Black Presbyterians. You were ordained in the Philadelphia Presbytery. You were my mother's role model and pastor, where she was ordained in the Philadelphia Presbytery as the first African American woman to be ordained within this presbytery. So she, like you, opened that door for other Black Presbyterian women and people to just work throughout the different levels of the presbytery. Let's talk about, you brought up Chester. So let's talk about the connection that you have to Chester and the Presbyterian churches that were once in that area. I believe there were 5, and now there is 1, and that is an African American member Presbyterian church. And the connection to the civil rights movement and some of the historical changes and collaborative actions that you, along with some of the other ministers in the city and the youth, were able to take a part in.
Mm-hmm. Early on, while I was the assistant pastor at First African under Shelley Waters, which is the position that I was ordained into, the pastor at Fifth Presbyterian Church left, and they did not have a pastor. And since there were 2 of us, Shelley Waters became the moderator of the session. And so to make sure that they had somebody preaching on Sunday morning, he told me, well, you go on over and you provide the preaching for them. And so I would teach my Sunday school class on Sunday morning of senior highs, and then I would jump in my little jittybug and ride on to Chester in order to be there in time for the worship service at 11. And so I did that for a while, but then in Chester, there was ferment to try to begin to deal with the segregated practices in the educational system, particularly in the high school. So there was a group called the Awakening Conference of Parents, and a lot of those parents who were involved in the early leadership and life of that group were in Fifth Presbyterian Church. And so as we talked together and they knew what I was doing in West Philadelphia, they asked me if I would come over and help them to organize to try to deal with the curriculum and the participation and the attitudes and the teaching programs at Chester High School and the public schools in Chester. So I started meeting with the Awakening Conference of Parents and helping them to organize, which ended up in a boycott of the Chester school system. We ended up pulling all the Black kids out of school. They were educated by teachers and adults in Black churches. Fifth Presbyterian Church had a large group around the corner. At Friendship House, we had a large group. We had a large group up at Bethany. We had a Baptist church. We had a large group at Calvary Baptist Church. We had them scattered around as we were pulling them out of the public schools. We ended up with folks laying down on the walks in front of the public schools to boycott and to picket, so that to kind of make folks know that we intended to keep the kids out of school. The political pressure caused some of the pastors to put us out of their churches because they were connected and we were not. But the end product was, as we tried to move to make changes, as we moved toward that, somebody threw a firebomb into Chester High School. And when they threw the firebomb into Chester High School, the end product was there was nowhere for the kids to go to school. So when they got the building halfway cleaned up, about half of the building remained. So that they put the high school students on a split shift. About half of them went at 7 o'clock in the morning and went to class until about 12. And then the other half went from 1 o'clock to about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so we ended up moving in that direction. At the same time, they ended up asking me, would I come to Chester to be the pastor at Fifth Presbyterian Church?
Which is now known as
M. Thomas. So Thomas M. Thomas is the remnant, or is the remaining body that Thomas Merton Thomas founded in 1899. He founded it. Thomas M. Thomas was a visionary. He was a graduate of Lincoln. He came to Chester and started a Black congregation in the Presbyterian Church. He had one of the first organs in a Black church in Delaware County. He was a business entrepreneur. So he developed some businesses in Chester because the Black community in Chester was limited. So he started some businesses, he owned some property, and then he built the help to put together the funds and the energy to build what is now the sanctuary at Thomas M. Thomas. It's only later that the Presbytery joined in 1960 to help to build what is now the center portion and to help get that dedicated. But the movement of Thomas M. Thomas and the Presbyterians was to try to begin to do things to promote change in the community, to enrich the life of people, even to the point of organizing and working with young people, working with adults, trying to help women find employment, helping to work with men's groups. And of course, a lot of men were involved in the church at that time. So that it's out of that movement that the Presbytery of Philadelphia began to put money in to help to support and develop the youth programs. And so they helped to operate under the broad ministry of the Presbytery in assisting churches. They began to develop a ministry with young people. They had young kids in, they had a daycare program that began in the morning. It went on into the early afternoon. And then after school, they had a full afternoon program. After school program ran from 4:30 in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 9 o'clock at night with a full staff in the center, a director, an assistant director. They had classes, they had activities. When I became the pastor, we even had programs that promoted the development and growth of musical groups. We had singing group because music was a big thing. So we had music groups, we had trios that played electric guitars and Congo drums and all that. And we would gather them together, let them train develop at the church. And then we made arrangements with some of the clubs in the area for them to have a program on Saturday afternoons, so they could put on a show that would allow parents and others in the community to come and to watch and see what they were doing. All kinds of other activities were promoted and supported for the whole age group. Out of that community involvement, the church grew. So that as the church grew, we were able to do more and more programs, and it began to pull in more and more parents. We had the children, and so because we had the children, we had the parents. I used to take the senior highs particularly, but the youth group to various activities in the Presbytery so that they would be exposed to what and how to compete and to function in relation to the broader society. We went to retreats, we went to camps, we went to all kinds of programs that the Presbytery set up for its Presbyterian youth. And I made sure that I had at least a carload or two that would go and attend all those events. The big Saturday affairs with workshops and banquets and musical concerts and all that stuff. There used to be a group that toured the country that sang about America. And they had a big show at First Church Germantown. And we carried 2 carloads of young people there. Your mother was a part of my youth group. She was a teenager at Chester and through junior high. And then after I left, she moved on into high school, but she was a part of my youth group. And early on, and your mother and your aunt and them were part of that group. And we would make sure that they were exposed and involved in all kinds of different things. Community activity and involvement social justice, education. When I went to Chester, there were about 34 organizations that were trying to deal with social change in the community. And I think I was instrumental in helping to bring all those groups together to sit down and talk about what we might be able to do together rather than everybody trying to move in a separate direction, doing their own thing. As usual, it was a struggle because folks were used to going in their different directions and doing their different things. But as they began to move, were able to get more denominational participation in helping to support organizations in Chester to promote housing and change. I was involved in Scott Paper Company, made a commitment of almost a little over $4.5 million to promote change and support in community development in Chester with a proposal that was made by Dr. Smith at Crozier Chester Theological Seminary. $1 million for housing, $1 million for education, $1 million for employment, and $1 million for recreation. Well, we formed a group called Citizens for Action Now, CAN, which I was the president of, and we hired staff and we started trying to work on how to implement plans that would allow the development in those different areas. The first thing that began to spun off was daycare. And so CAN had daycare in 2 or 3 different places in Chester, including what was the old Third Presbyterian Church. Chester, when I went to Chester, had 5 Presbyterian churches. Fifth Presbyterian Church was the last one formed. It was the only Black congregation in Philadelphia. First Presbyterian Church was over in First Ward. The Second Presbyterian Church was down on 3rd Street in the Italian community. Third Presbyterian Church was over on 9th Street. There was the 4th church was Highland Avenue, which was down close to the Polish area in Chester. By the time I was there for just a little while, just before I got there, Second Presbyterian Church had a fire. And they decided, rather than to stay in Chester, they bought some land out in Aston, Pennsylvania, and built an A-frame Presbyterian Church, A-frame building out in Aston, which is still out there. So they moved their congregation out of Chester and into Aston. Third Presbyterian Church, as the community began to change, was suffering a loss of membership. And so there was a move to combine Third Presbyterian Church and First Presbyterian Church. There was a bitter battle because families had split over participation in the life of Third Church and First Church. And so they were fighting each other not to go back and be in one church. But Third Church died and First Church ended up being the remnant there. Highland Avenue down the other end stayed for a while, but then as the older membership died away, the community around them changed. Highland Avenue eventually gave up. Which left First Church and Fifth Presbyterian Church as the only 2 Presbyterian churches open and active in Chester. I left Fifth Presbyterian Church in 1971 to become the first Black associate executive of the Presbytery of Philadelphia. My area of responsibility was mission program. Under the area of mission program, more than half of the Presbytery's budget was in my portfolio. We did new church development. We supported programs at local churches. We developed a Spanish-speaking parish over in the Kensington area that had 5 churches. We supported churches that were going through minister changes. We supported campus ministries, like at the University of Pennsylvania, through Tabernacle Presbyterian Church, so that we did a variety of different things, which I was glad and enthusiastic about seeing, because it allowed me to continue to promote change and growth in the community. We became active in helping to put together Korean congregations in the city. We already had a Japanese congregation, but we began to support and work with the Koreans in helping to develop Korean churches and helping them to acquire churches in Presbyterian Philadelphia, because the larger churches ministry in Korea had helped to develop a lot of Koreans who were Presbyterian. Of course, that's a whole nother story. But as the Koreans were seeking to live and to worship in Philadelphia, they were looking to develop Presbyterian Korean congregations. So part of my work was to help to promote them. But it allowed, moving into that position allowed me to continue to work with and to support Fifth Presbyterian Church. The Reverend Johnny Monroe, that we had brought to Philadelphia to do a new church development project in North Philadelphia, which was interesting because the worship service was on Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock when everybody was on Ridge Avenue in North Philadelphia. They weren't on Ridge Avenue on Sunday morning because the stores were closed. So we put together a worship service that was Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock. And then the ministry took in kids, it took in adults. There were more than 100 kids and adults involved in that ministry. As he preached there on Saturday, when I left Thomas M. Thomas, or when I left Fifth Presbyterian Church, he was free to preach on Sunday morning. So they invited him to come over and to fill the pulpit on Sunday morning, and eventually they asked him if he would come and become the pastor. He did become the pastor, stayed there over 10 years. And in the course of that time, they decided to change the name from Fifth Presbyterian Church to Thomas M. Thomas in order to honor the founding pastor. This year, we're celebrating the 120th anniversary of the founding of Thomas M. Thomas. The celebration started last year, 2019, and of course is continuing to go on with the hope that we will have a banquet in September. But we don't know what this germ is going to let us do. So that's a mystery for us. But the whole thrust has been to try to help see what we could do in promoting life, quality, and welfare, the welfare of the community in Chester. First Presbyterian Church eventually died as the community changed. Remember, as the ministry of First Presbyterian Church was in First Ward, which was all white. It was never integrated, but when it began to integrate, members of First Presbyterian Church began to move away. And so the church ended up with not enough congregational support to be able to exist, so that it eventually died. Rather than trying to move Thomas M. Thomas over there, folks at Thomas M. Thomas decided to stay right where they were. And so the presbytery sold First Presbyterian Church, which was surrounded by other churches, which had been large churches and white, but as the community changed, those churches had died and buildings were sold off. Today, Fifth or Thomas M. Thomas Presbyterian Church is the last of the Presbyterian ministries in Chester. With our thrust is we are committed to staying to help the community by helping to support and be participants in helping to improve the quality of life. Whatever it takes, we are ready to try to see if we can support that. One of the things that we know is that the quality of life in Chester is affected by the housing, by the education, which has been suffering because of the lack of funding. Housing has been suffering. The city has come through with developmental plans and have torn down a lot of houses. Houses have not been replaced those. The general quality of life needs a lot of support, particularly in the area of medical care, medical support, programs that would help to promote the welfare of the community, things that would help support families who are remaining in the community are lacking. And so we see part of our ministry as being trying to find ways to work with young people, work with families, work with community change, and to promote growth and development in the community. The Caregiver Society is intended to be just that kind of tool that provides support for those folks who are giving support to older adults, who are giving support for people who are terminally ill, who are taking care of children, the third time, grandparents taking care of children, special needs children, people who are working with and have special needs children, to see if we can provide some support that will allow them and nurture them in trying to go forward and do what they're trying to do and find some spiritual support for that.
Now, you mentioned earlier mission, which was the goal of the ministers that were with you, providing opportunities. The focus was mission. As far as I know, from Thomas and Thomas and the ministers that I was around, they have always been mission driven. Now I see that the Presbyterian Church USA, their focus is now mission. But the Black Presbyterians have been very innovative over the years with their mission focused goals. I want to talk about very quickly, not quickly, but I want you to mention one of those mission projects, accomplishments that you, along with Reverend Monroe, were able to bring to the city of Chester. There was a need on that side of Chester where there was a lack of fire stations and firemen on the side of Chester where Thomas and Thomas is located. Can you tell us about that important accomplishment, and if you can remember what year that was, that you, along with Reverend Monroe and others, were able to make happen?
I was pausing because I was trying to remember the year, but there was a fire in Chester on 7th Street, if I remember correctly. Well, let me back up. Chester had a voluntary fire system, voluntary fire department. All of the voluntary fire homes existed, firehouses existed, but they didn't have Black folks participating. The limited hiring that the city did not include Black folks. So one of the things that Johnny Monroe was able to do was to help push and organize to force the city to begin to look at hiring Black folks. The fire on that end of town, off of Tillman, they lost children, and the response time was so slow that the fire was full grown when they got there. They were not able to save them. One of the things that they did was to start pushing, because there was no firehouse in the area.
And that's another side of where the one firehouse was, on another side of town.
Right. One firehouse was on the other side of town. Another firehouse Feltonville was below town, so that you didn't have a firehouse in. The fact of the matter is, there was a Black community in the middle of Chester that had no firehouse, period. White, Black, green, or purple. So that if there was a fire there, you had to wait for the voluntary companies to come in order to respond. Even today, with a firehouse right down the street from Thomas M. Thomas, less than a block away, it takes 3 to 5 minutes, more like 5 to 10 minutes, for them to respond to an emergency at Thomas M. Thomas. Because the system is such that if you call in a fire alarm, it has to go into City Hall, it has to be processed at City Hall and sent back out to the firehouse, which is right down the street. So that if there's a major blaze or an explosion, you can be fully engrossed before the firehouse even gets the notice, even though we have fire alarms all through the building. And you can pull the lever and set off the alarm. But by the time it gets translated, a lot of things can happen. What Reverend Monroe did was to go after the city to plant a firehouse in the area so that there could be a much more rapid response. The city was reluctant to do that. So they had to organize the community, picket the city, force the City Hall to finally appropriate the money to build a firehouse, and they still threaten today to not have enough money to keep it open. It's in that firehouse that they began to hire the first Black fireman for the fire department in Chester. Joe Morris was one of the first Black firemen hired, and now he's retired, but he was one of the first Black firemen hired to fight on the fire department in Chester, Pennsylvania.
That was my cousin.
Yeah, that only came because Johnny Monroe and pastors and them got together and they decided something needed to happen. Now, Johnny Monroe ended up in jail, but the pastors supported him and bailed him out, and they were able to push forward until the city reluctantly built the firehouse. And now they continue to talk about, in the cutting of budget, that's one of the first places that has to be cut because they can't afford to keep the budget, to fund the operation of that firehouse. But it is critical to the community because as housing has deteriorated, it is more likely that the fires are going to take place in the areas where that fire company can respond very rapidly, much more rapidly than trying to bring a firehouse from across town or below town to try to come in and to respond to it. So, that's one of the things. The whole movement, particularly under the leadership of Reverend Monroe there, as the pastor at Thomas M. Thomas, a lot of the work was to try to push and develop and work with improving the nature of the community. One of the things that they did under his leadership was to create a preschool program called Learning Tree. Learning Tree was founded to try to begin to prepare young people, children, 2 to 4 years old, to enter kindergarten, ready to begin to learn. Almost right across the street from Thomas M. Thomas was Sacred Heart Church, Catholic Church with a parochial school. The tie was originally that the children were going to go through Learning Tree and over into the parochial school, and that way they would be able to begin to get a better quality of education because the Chester school system was going down. As it turns out, the population change has meant that the Catholic churches eventually closed down their parochial school. The building is still sitting there. She's being used for other causes. The church is still sitting there and only used on special occasions, so that tie was broken. But Learning Tree is responsible for developing young people in the community, preparing them for entry level into school, so much so, it is one of the 10 best preschool programs in Delaware County, certified by the state. Their children have gone into school and have excelled. As we begin to look at some of our more recent additions to the church, there have been students who were started school in Learning Tree, went to college, graduated with honors and scholarships and all the rest, and are now working in business and are still coming back and participating in the life of Thomas M. Thomas. So we've had the ministry, as I said earlier, the ministry has produced growth in the congregation. One of the things that the whole church has not figured out yet is, without the emphasis on educational ministry, how do we recruit Black folks into the church? Because evangelism in the Black church is critically needed, but don't know how to do it, because there's never been a movement to try to figure out how you evangelize in the African American community for Presbyterians. We knew how to do it with education. But now, once we decided that we were going to support public education and not private education, which we did with almost 600 educational institutions from preschool all the way up through college. Now, when we stopped doing that, we stopped being able to recruit.
And we'll get into that. We will get into that piece a little later when we discuss what is the purpose of the church in the community. Speaking about some of the more radical activities that were taking place with the ministers at TMT and just within the Presbyterian Church USA in general, I want to tie that to Johnson C. Smith Seminary. I want to go back to that particular school and why that school was so important, particularly in the time that you were there and my mother was there, and these all the other colleagues of yours and hers during that time, which led to the Black clergy having such a strong emphasis during those times, the 60s to the 80s to the 90s, where it was really focused on social justice, the betterment of the communities. I mean, I recall when I was a young child, and I recall my mom saying, well, she's saying that she was so excited about joining the ministry because she saw ministers in a different way. You and Reverend Monroe were wearing afros and dashikis, and other people were doing the same thing, and she loved that. And then as I was a child, I recall the ministers the same way, maybe not so much with the afros at that time, but just dashikis and African garb. And, you know, one of my mother's friends had spent time in the either the Sudan or Cameroon, I can't remember. She lived there for a while. And that goes on to mission that that Black Presbyterians have always had a focus on. Reverend Dr. Marcia Snelligan Haney is a missiologist. She taught missiology. She ran mission trips. My mother took mission trips. You took mission trips. Everyone during that time, many of you took mission trips. And I want to tie that into Johnson C. Smith Seminary, birthing ministers and clergy like you who have gone on and done wonderful, wonderful things, not just within the presbytery, but contributing to the world, the community at large. Can you speak about the importance of Johnson C. Smith, the foundations that was built upon, and why social justice, the impact of social justice carried on from when you were there to when those came after you?
The teaching at Johnson C. Smith, both the undergraduate, but particularly the seminary, the teaching at the seminary was directed at and helping us to understand the role that we had in helping to implement God's purpose in the world. Only to say that we learned that there was no differentiation in God's creation, and that all of us were valued. That was important because that was not what was being experienced all around. Because we understood and learned the importance of that, it caused us to begin to look at the nature of Christian teaching, the limiting of Christian teaching and theology in a lot of places, because it was crippling in that it kept us from thinking about God's liberating presence in the lives of folks. And as we began to explore and push that in seminary and around, we began to realize, as things were unfolding around us, the limiting nature of theological education in America. And so we began to take off, and we had folks who were beginning to write differently to help us to begin to catch a vision that would carry us differently in terms of how we were to move. But we also understood Scripture differently, because we began to understand that Scripture did not have a European base. We began to understand that there's a difference between theological understandings through a European eye and the theological understanding through a North African eye. And I say that only to say that when you look at the base for Christianity, it comes from Northeast Africa, not Europe. It is a whole life, pastoral, participatory life. Christ teaches us for the wholeness of life. Nothing is separated from you're living out God's purpose in your life. You can't differentiate between your education and who you're going to work with and different people in the community and all of that. If you're going to be Christian, then you've got to encompass all of life in what you do and how you respond. And everybody's included in that. We began to learn that. Folks learned that early on at Johnson C. Smith. What many folks don't realize is that many of the people who were active in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. were Presbyterians who were loaned to his movement by the denomination, who were interested in being involved and helping things to happen. It caused the institution to begin to look at its own life, so much so that even the white stated clerk chained himself to the fences to begin to demonstrate against the injustices, because he began to see and understand something of what was being reflected and taught by the African-American pastors. We could not see ministry without being involved in the lives of the people and in the changes that were needed to see that all of God's people were treated equally. So that everywhere we went, that was constantly before us. It was the theological base of understanding that came out of Johnson C. Smith Theological Center that helped us to understand the fullness of God, and also the fact that Christ was not European, because every vision that we had, everything that confronted us said that Christ came with a European image. All of Christology showed missionaries going to Africa and converting folks to live like Europeans in order to be Christian. One of the reasons that Christianity was rejected in Africa was because they come in and they try to change the community to be like white folks in Europe, rather than looking at how Christ can enlighten and be an active part in the African community that they were coming to. So that missionaries were no longer encouraged for that very reason. If they couldn't accept Africans where they were and help them to see Christ in who they were, then they didn't want them there. We began to see that in the same movement in our communities, so that we became very much involved in trying to see that the church was responsive to and supporting the needs of the people. That's how we began to come at the need for civil rights, for civil justice. Laws had to change, communities had to change, housing had to change. All of those things that oppressed people because of race and color had to be changed, because that's not what God intended for the world when God created the world. And that whole thrust came out of the ruminating on what we had learned in our understanding of Christology or Christ's teachings, beginning with what we learned at Johnson C. Smith University. You know, one of the blessings that I received was working with a professor at Johnson C. Smith University who was also on both staffs. He was the head of the department, Algernon Odell Steele. I was his student assistant for 3.5 years. I walked with him, worked with him. You know, he wrote a book on, he wrote a couple of books on Christ and scriptures, the Bible and the human quest. That helped us to begin to refocus what the purpose of the Bible was, and where and how you viewed the Bible, and it has affected my life for 80 years. Well, I can't say 80 years because I'm only 85 now, but for at least 65 years, it has affected my life in going through and studying under him and working with him. He was intimately involved in my work, so much so that when he became ill, I was the one that he selected to teach his classes while he was out, because he felt like I was equipped and understood and could work with his community classes and lead some of his courses on campus. But it's an understanding of Christianity that was very different. And because it was, you got folks that, that went south to participate in SCLC. You have folks who went down. Some of the folks who sued the public education in Chester, in Charlotte, were folks who were graduates of Johnson C. Smith Theological Seminary and sued the school system because their children were not getting adequate education. And so much so that it became a class action suit that caused the school system in Charlotte to have to revise, in Mecklenburg County, to revise itself in order to treat and accept Black students differently. The Swains sued, they took their daughter out and sued, and the school system had to change. They couldn't treat them as semi-segregated, even though they were going to the same school, they were being treated differently. But he was a seminary graduate. So that we had more and more of that going on as folks began to fully understand what we were learning and what the implication of that was and the time in which it began to happen. Some of that, I think those two things were closely tied together. Some of the teaching and the time, because some of those teachings had been going on in earlier times, but the ministers were trying to find other ways to respond and enrich and help things to happen in the community. But as the civil rights time came, it created a climate in which it could be much more visible, much more vocal, and much more energetic. And so you began to find lawsuits that were being filed. You began to see pickets that were being filed. Not a demonstration took place in the South that you didn't have Presbyterians participating in, both clergy and lay, to promote change, because that was the nature of the time. Not only were we looking at trying to see that it changed in the community, but we were pushing to make sure that it happened in the denomination. The denominational, as I said very early on, the Presbyterian Church is an institutional church. It has been an institutional church that has embraced, encouraged, and supported racism. The thrust of the caucuses historically has been trying to change the institution. That became more possible as the civil rights movement took place. And as the civil rights movement began to unfold, we developed in Philadelphia Presbytery a chapter of what we call the Black Presbyterians United. Now, in 1967, as the thrust was moving across the country, there was a national movement to try to get reparations for slavery and all that. That movement created a thirst for change inside the church, because the church had some responsibility to participate in helping in the reparations to happen. As the church was pressed to do that, it began to look for ways that it might find some relief. We thought there had been a history of Black ministers coming together across the denomination since the early 20th century, which would have put it around the early 1900s. They would get together informally, off and on, in different kinds of ways. The ministers of the East and the West, the ministers of the North and the South, had different kinds of titles and names. As the National Black Rights Group came together in the 1960s, African Americans or Black folks in the denomination began to say, in order to speak to the institution, we need to have an institutional presence. And so we created a national organization called Black Presbyterians United. Black Presbyterians United then began to look at how to speak to the denomination and try to get the denomination to begin to respond to its racism, to participate in helping to break down racism in the country, educationally, in the communities, and all around. That was shortly after my ordination. And so I was caught up in that suite. We lost one of the founders, or one of the early figures in that whole thing, Gayrod Wilmore, about 2 weeks ago. But Gay is a professor in theological seminaries. He has written several books about Black theology, Black radicalism, being Black and Presbyterian. But one of the things that Gay did was the church pulled him out of the seminary and asked him to head a group in New York inside the denomination called the Commission on Race. Gay started helping the church to focus on its confrontation with racism. As he did that, he was helping to get involved in different kinds of things. And I came along at just the right time for my mentor and Clarence Cave and a couple of other folks to get together and say, look, go on with us up to New York. They dragged me up to New York with them. And I participated in some of those gatherings that Gay Wilmore put together, so that the organizer for Fight in New York, Rochester, New York, against Kodak Eastman, he was at one of those as he talked about community organizing around issues and not just organizing people to be together. They carried me or dragged me all across the country in all kinds of meetings and things. We gathered all the Black Presbyterians together in St. Louis and ended up picking in the hotel because they didn't have enough Black folks working in there and didn't have any Black folks working at the desk and all that. So we all gathered in the lobby and picketed the hotel. But it's all of those kinds of things that began to happen. And so they moved me along inside the stream so that while I was moving as a pastor, I was being invited to participate in and being elected to various levels in the governing bodies to participate as a racial ethnic person, which ended up giving me the freedom and allowing me to assume the freedom to be able to say whatever I thought needed to be said that would direct things. Now, it was a fight to get me on as the associate executive for the Presbyterian of Philadelphia. That's a whole nother story. They finally, under pressure from the population of the Black population of the Presbytery and young white folks who were our allies, moved to hire a Black associate executive. First time in the history of Presbyterian Philadelphia.
Let's talk about some of your first within the denomination and those roles that you carried on the corporate level and some of the struggles that took place to get you there.
When we started working with the Presbyterian of Philadelphia, the whole idea was for the Presbytery to begin to respond and find ways to visually and organizationally respond to the racism that was active in our community and in the institution. They started to respond by saying, okay, we'll hire an associate executive. They started their process. And of course, the folks in the Philadelphia chapter of Black Presbyterian told me, submit your material. So I submitted my resume and my material. They moved through the process. And then the white folks decided that they wanted to hire and consider an associate on the staff of the Presbytery of Chicago. Our folks decided that's not adequate. You can't make that decision for us. So they stood up, drew back, and started hollering. The end product was the Presbyterian of Philadelphia ended up not calling him, but calling me instead to be the associate for mission program. Now there were two others, one for finance and one for planning and strategy. But I was the one who was going to be responsible for mission program. The struggle then was once I became the associate executive for mission program, was to begin to look at how we revamp the whole attitude about mission program that did not subjugate or cause Black folks to be in a subjugated position. We had missions in the Presbyterian of Philadelphia where churches were being supported with funds from other churches, but in order to get the funds, they had to have elders from the white churches on their sessions in order to make sure that they knew how to manage the money. We had other programs where the church put in a chunk of funds, but in order for the program to use the funds, they had to have their board comprised of a fair-sized number of folks from the church, the white church who was contributing, in order to make the right kinds of decisions. And some of the programs had to come out of that part of town and over to First Church. You know, we had all kinds of stuff going on. So in the course of my time, part of the struggle was, how do you get to the point where churches are treated equally? You know, we had churches where Black churches had to buy the church building from a white church who was also Presbyterian. First African had to buy the building that it was on 42nd and Girard from a Berea Presbyterian church that was a white church that had died in that corner because the community had changed. But they had to pay a mortgage in order to get the building at a time when all property was supposed to belong to the whole body. So I couldn't understand why the Black church had to pay the white church in order to move into the building. If it belongs to the denomination and our folks can use it, why can't they move into it? Berean Presbyterian Church, when it moved off of South College, had to pay the Bethlehem Presbyterian Church at Broad and Diamond, had to take out a mortgage to pay Holy Trinity so that they could use the Bethlehem building, because Holy Trinity was further up and not in the heart of North Philadelphia. So when I came on staff, Berean was paying a mortgage to Holy Trinity Bethlehem. And I just could not understand all of that. So part of my struggle was, how do you help to make change take place? So it took a while, but then we got the mortgage at Holy Trinity Bethlehem taken care of and forgiven. We got money allocated to help to provide a parking lot for Berean, and also to help make some repairs on the Berean building. Never could quite get the First African thing settled, because First African had paid off their mortgage, had also raised over $250,000 to renovate the old educational building and enlarge it so that they could carry on a broader ministry at 42nd and Girard. We got rules changed in the presbytery so that no congregation could put money into another congregation and insist that they have members on the session, because we had that whole practice going on. And in fact, I met with the treasurer at Menley James at one point, because he was the representative on the board of one of the churches. And I said, this doesn't make sense. You all put money in. Why should you be making decisions? That's a mission money. That's mission money. That's a gift. But we finally got that eliminated. We got the one eliminated where the church said, we'll put the money in, but they have to come out to us. Said, no, you finally got the presbytery to say, to adopt the policy that you can put the money into the mission budget of the presbytery, but you can't control it. And you don't have to be on the board. But we had all kinds of struggles like that. Personally, I found it I found it difficult to understand why I couldn't preach in certain churches. I don't think I'm a terrible preacher, but I think I can adequately preach. But there are white churches that I couldn't preach in, was never invited to preach in. There were other white churches that I was invited to preach in. But that kind of attitude and operation existed my whole life in the Presbyterian Church. As it turned out, one of the churches that I visited and was invited to preach in was a tall steeple church. And when I finished, one of the questions that one of the elders asked is, why can't he be considered to be the pastor of our church? And he was told, no, you can't consider him. The response was, he's on the staff. But nobody came to me and asked me whether I would be interested in becoming the pastor of that church, which was a tall steeple church. When I left the Presbytery of Philadelphia, after almost 10 years, a little over 11 years, almost 11 years, I became the Synod executive for the Synod of Piedmont. Now, that synod was made up of an all-Black synod, which was the Synod of Catawba, and the Synod of, the Synod that included Delaware, Maryland, District of Columbia. And they had put those two groups together. They had taken 3 presbyteries and then took the 4 presbyteries in the Black Synod and created a special administrative unit for them so that they function like a presbytery instead of being represented as presbyteries in this mix. So they had all kinds of difficulties. They had to put a commission in there from the General Assembly. And the commission was present when I was interviewed and called to be the pastor. And we functioned for about a year before the commission. In fact, when I was called, the commission was dissolved. But I found when I got there, all these practices going on that still segregated the groups. When they had a council meeting, certain members would get together and they would have a party for those folks that they invited. And that would leave folks out. And I said, well, now, whoa, wait a minute, this ain't gonna work. So I had to then move the atmosphere around so that we eliminated private parties. And we would socialize as a community. at all council meetings and at other kinds of meetings. But here again, I was invited to preach at some of the Black churches, but not white churches.
Why do you think that? Do you think
I know what it is.
is it because of
I can
liberation theology?
I can be a Senate executive because that's so far from being at the point where I'm counseling their wives and their daughters. I do believe that's a major factor. They may not ever say that publicly, but attitudinally, in tall steeple churches and places like that, it's easier to talk about a Senate executive who is removed from a close touch life than having somebody close enough to be able to counsel wives, marry daughters, and being intimately involved in the life of the church.
Providing pastoral care.
Yeah, the Methodists tried to get away from that before I left Chester. The Methodist Conference in the Philadelphia area adopted the position that they were going to put Black ministers in white churches and white ministers in Black churches. One of the ministers that I worked with in Chester, Trinity Methodist Church, there at 9th and Carroll, Roberts was his name. They moved him from there to West Philadelphia. The pastor, one of the pastors, the pastor of the Swarthmore Presbyterian Church, they moved him from a district superintendent into that church as the pastor. Because what they tried to do clearly was to provide Black leadership in white churches. The presbytery doesn't have the authority to do that.
Now,
the presbytery has to move by election.
In Delaware at First and Olivet, was that church considered mixed, or was it considered a predominantly white church when Reverend Warren Dennis was there, and then my mother took over? Because that, growing up, that was one of the first Presbyterian churches, multiracial Presbyterian churches that I had envisioned. So my outlook on the world was completely multiracial, multicultural, because my mother was a female pastor of this. I mean, I believe we had more white members than Black, and they were wealthy.
Yep, but see, because some of them stayed. That used to be a fairly good-sized white church, and then it started going through community change because Hispanic community was blowing up around it. Then they had a white pastor and a Black pastor, because Brenda Collier's husband, Merrick Collier, who had been an Episcopal priest and became Presbyterian, Merrick Collier came to Wilmington to be the associate pastor at First and Olivet. But they had both the ministry at First and Olivet, the building that you know, and then the building at the corner was the old Third Presbyterian, the old Third Presbyterian Church, which was in another denomination that merged. When they merged, we had both buildings. It was another Presbyterian church, I put it that way. And then when they merged, we had both buildings. Well, they carried on a community ministry in the building there right on 4th Street. So that Merritt's program was primarily in what is now a Spanish church, and the white pastor was over providing leadership. Kaminsky was over at a leadership at what's the First and Olivet building. But First and Olivet was primarily a white church. It had out of the community, Dick Kaminsky had invited in and got some white folks, some Black folks to participate. By the time Warren got there, you had Black, Hispanic, and white. The blessing was that you had some white folks there who were fairly wealthy, who were fairly liberal, and felt like they wanted to participate in a multicultural church.
During that time.
and they were committed to doing that. You know, some of the harshest words that I've heard were for some white folks to the presbytery for closing that church. And blasted. We were asked to speak at a Presbyterian meeting, and Ann blasted them.
Which, well,
but
I was gonna say which Ann, but you don't have to say.
you know which one I'm talking about.
Okay.
Little short lady.
Uh-huh.
But her husband never attended that I know of. But when she got sick, I took communion over to her. But there were several of them who were very articulate, participated, and kept pushing the life of that church be kept alive, be kept supported and that it would keep going. But as it turned out, the church ended up being closed because we talked about trying to make it a Hispanic congregation. But that's not necessarily where Newcastle Presbytery was ready to commit resources to help that to happen. Because my suggestion to them was, look at helping to bring in a Hispanic associate while Warren was there, and let them be active in the community to help to pull people in and to develop a community ministry, so that you then have access to both a Black and a white community as it changed. Because in the time that I spent there after your mother left, I ended up with Black, Hispanic, and white folks there. Mm-hmm. And had an interesting time with all of them, marrying daughters and all that kind of stuff, mm-hmm. because you could walk right around the community and have your hands on a lot of those folks. But here again, I say that some of that is the institutional racism. They don't see the value in committing resources to help things like that begin to happen. And because it doesn't, there's not the freedom to just open up and invite the community in and help the church to be what it can be if you allow the natural influence of the community to be a part of it. You know, as I said to them at some points, you know, if you can open it up and allow the Hispanic element to be very much involved in the life of the church, it may change the music, it may change the style, but it'll help the church to be alive in the community. Everybody doesn't have to worship the same way. You know, you can allow worship to take place in the way that folks feel comfortable and that they want to worship, and you just participate in that manner and let that be.
Which is now what we call today within the denomination new worshiping communities. And that is what the Caregiver Society is, a new worshiping community. Before we go, I want your opinion on the role of the church in how has the role, or in your opinion, has the role of the church changed primarily in the aspect of in smaller, lower income demographic areas? Has the role of the church changed as far as assisting the needs of its residents? And what has been that change, what the reasons behind that change, and what needs to be done moving forward?
I think the church has gone through a metamorphosis. It has moved from being at various levels an agent of mission to decide to adopt a position of supporting mission in a time when institutional racism and institutional acceptance of disadvantaged poverty and disadvantaged communities, poverty and all that is rampant. The church isn't equipped institutionally to deal with that. I think when you talk, the hope is in the form that many presbyteries and synods have adopted now, the idea is we'll support the local churches. And if a church has a program and has an idea about how it might respond to the needs of the community, we'll try to support that. But we don't have a program of our own that's intended to try to help do that. And that's at the time when institutional decisions are made that disadvantage the disadvantaged community, that feed upon the disadvantaged community. Let me give you an example. We've got a lot of poor people in the community. The church does not have a systemic way in its system to try to look at how do we help to create vehicles that would help to respond to that. One of the things that I see that's exciting me right now is young people are looking at the massive surplus of food in this country and are trying to design ways to get that food off of the farms where it's being plowed under into disadvantaged communities through food banks so that people who do not have can eat. That's the kind of thing that an institution can help to happen without individuals having to plan on how we can help this to happen.
Large scale change.
You know, if you've got milk, we know that there's this surplus of food because nothing's moving. The restaurants aren't open, potatoes are piling up, vegetables are piling up, milk is being poured down the drain. If you know that's true, what vehicle do you have, or what pressure can you put on the institutions to help that to be moved so that people can eat, be fed, and not suffer because they're hungry? We've got young people, we've got children who are not eating enough. We've got adults who are not eating enough. We've got, and it's not just now while the COVID pandemic is here, this is true all the time. The government pays farmers to raise food and not put it on the market so that they can maintain prices. That's ludicrous to me. If God helps us to provide, to grow the food, why can't we find ways to take that food and for people who don't have the resources, see that they're able adequately to eat, to receive food, to be able to go forward. They don't have to use all of their money to try to pay rent and food. Take care of your rent, we'll make sure that you have food. There's an inability to see the necessity for all of us being responsible for each other and developing institutional ways to respond to this. No local church can take care of all of that. It can be in a network that helped that to happen, but a local church can't do that. What we end up doing is expecting that the church is able to do something when in fact, the whole church isn't interested in doing it. There are individuals in the church who are interested in doing it. And that's been the history of institutions, including the church in this country. The Presbyterian Church, at some points, tries to historically innovate to respond to change. But that's only when you can get a massive number of people who are sensitive to it to act on it. And if they don't act on it, then they can't respond to it. As one who has provided leadership at the regional level, the largest synod in the denomination, there were things that I could not do because I couldn't get an action from the body that would support those things being done. If I had been able to get the action from the body, then there were things that we might have been able to do. For example, through North Carolina, we know that toxic waste is being poured out all along the roads. They drive down there at night, open up the valves, and just let that stuff spill all along the side of the road. Now, kids are walking along those roads. Animals are feeding along those roads. But we can't do anything about it because the institutions are not geared up to shut down and to inspect and to penalize the folks who do that because of wealth, because of organization, because of lack of desire. Somewhere, and I think that's what Black Presbyterians have been pushing the denomination to do, is that we have to look at how we respond to those things that jeopardize the people that God has created. When I was at the General Assembly in 1974, the biggest question was, how do we support farm workers? Cesar Chavez was trying to organize the farm workers in California so that they could get adequate housing, adequate pay, adequate care. The committee that I chaired managed to get Cesar Chavez invited to the General Assembly to speak to a recommendation that the Presbyterian Church USA that the United Presbyterian Church go on record supporting the Farmers Union in California. Now, that was a major fight because Presbyterians did not want to do that, but we managed to put it together. And once he spoke, then I recommended to the General Assembly that we adopt the resolution. And they did, to the shock of some folks. But it was important because it put the whole denomination behind the Farmers Union and allowed others to say, well, you know, if the Presbyterian Church is supporting it, we need to take a look at it and see how we're going to respond. Everybody in the Presbyterian Church didn't support that. I know that. But the fact that we adopted that allowed the stated clerk to say for the denomination, this is what we've adopted. This is where our strength is. The chief executive officer was able to say that. And in other places, the presbyteries and synods could say, our denomination supports the union, the farmers.
I think that's a great place for us to end this segment. Okay. I think that I would like to speak more about the structural racism, institutionalized racism, and changes that have taken place in the past moving into today, because I have my own concerns as a member of the denomination and an employee of the denomination. To be honest, I am very troubled by not only the pandemic, but the continuation of structural policies put in place to purposely oppress Black and brown people, and the police brutality that has been continued during this health crisis. The double standards for why some of the police brutality is taking place currently today. Some people not social distancing, where the officers are giving out masks because they're not wearing masks, and then Black and brown people getting beat because they're not social distancing, and some of the police officers are not wearing masks or gloves when they are going into Black and brown neighborhoods. And then the continuation of these self-proclaimed vigilantes who want to take the law into they're not taking the law into their own hands. They just want to kill someone Black. That's really what it is, the bottom line. So I have my own concerns about what the institution of the Presbyterian Church, if they have a desire to even want to help combat the structural forces that are in place that are keeping people oppressed, because there are people who benefit from the structural racism and also benefit from our contributions in society.
Yeah.
So with that being said, I welcome you to come back so we can further discuss that piece of it. Today, I wanted to talk about you and your contributions to history within the Presbyterian Church USA, the Philadelphia Presbytery, which again is the birthplace of the Presbyterian denomination within America, as well as the birthplace of the Black Presbyterian, where you have had first, my mother has had first, and without you two, well, I shouldn't say, I'm not going to put it that way, not without, but you two opened the doors for many other possibilities for people to achieve. And so with that being said, I just want to thank you so much for taking this time to speak with the Caregivers Society. And some may say, well, what does this have to do with it? Well, you know, I think it's important to know that because this is a new worshiping community, it is part of a mission of the church. And as that mission, as a Caregiver Society, the social responsibility portion of our mission is to provide educational resources, and any other type of help that we can to our community. And I think it's important that when people understand the history, primarily children, when they understand the history of organizations, when they hear the positivity and they hear the struggles, it helps them grow into successful adults, and not just children growing into adults. It brings out a sense of pride with everyone to say, you know what, wow, I know him. I didn't realize all of those things. He accomplished all of those things. Or just for general educational purposes. I think it's important to document and record our history within this denomination, because many of you have contributed so much on the clergy level, on the corporate levels, and around the globe, preaching and teaching the love of Jesus, which includes everyone. And Jesus was also, he worked with the least of these, and that is what the basis of Christianity is to accept everyone and to support everyone. And I think within the Presbyterian denomination, the Black church, or the Black denomination, or the Black aspect of the Presbyterian denomination, the clergy and members have done have done greatly in that aspect. So before we go, is there anything else you would like to just say to the viewers before we go and come back on the next segment?
Well, I thank them for watching and listening. Sitting and talking about things brings up a lot of things in my mind, and it's always good to try to reflect and see where we've been, where we need to go, and what needs to happen to help us to get there. If we stay where we are, we're not going to be able to become who we need to become. And I think all of us have to take a hand in trying to move things forward, recognizing that it's only in the participation of all of us that we're going to get to where God intends for us to be.
And I think we're good with that. So Reverend Dr. Carroll D. Jenkins, thank you so much. And until next time, again, I am Kieran Warren. This is the Caregiver Society. This is Beyond COVID-19, where we have been discussing the Black Church, the role of African Americans, and the National Black Presbyterian Caucus within the Presbyterian Denomination USA. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and take care. Bye now.
You're welcome.